What you eat first thing in the morning can silently determine whether your body burns fat all day or stores it, especially around your belly. One common breakfast habit is quietly disrupting your insulin balance and pushing your metabolism in the wrong direction without you even realizing it. When you consume a high-carbohydrate breakfast on an empty stomach, particularly refined carbohydrates like white bread, sugary cereals, pastries, or sweetened beverages, your digestive system absorbs glucose extremely rapidly. Because there is no significant protein, fiber, or fat to slow down digestion, this glucose enters the bloodstream almost immediately. This creates a sharp rise in blood sugar levels within a short period of time. In response to this sudden spike, your pancreas releases a large amount of insulin. Insulin is a powerful storage hormone. Its primary role is to move glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cells for energy. However, when insulin is released in excess, especially early in the day, it shifts the body into a strong fat storage mode. One of the most important effects of elevated insulin is its impact on lipolysis, which is the process of breaking down stored fat for energy. High insulin levels actively block this process. Instead of allowing your body to access fat reserves, insulin signals your cells to store incoming energy. Over time, repeated high insulin breakfast patterns train your body to rely more on glucose and less on fat oxidation. This becomes especially problematic in the abdominal region. Visceral fat, which accumulates around internal organs, is highly sensitive to insulin. When insulin levels remain frequently elevated due to poor breakfast choices, fat storage is preferentially directed toward the midsection. This is not just a cosmetic issue. It is metabolically active fat that contributes to inflammation, insulin resistance, and hormonal imbalance. Another critical factor is the insulin-glucagon balance. Glucagon is the counter-regulatory hormone to insulin. While insulin stores energy, glucagon helps mobilize stored energy, especially from fat tissue. A high-carbohydrate breakfast suppresses glucagon activity for several hours, effectively shutting down fat-burning pathways in the morning when your metabolism should ideally be most active. Additionally, this insulin surge affects other key hormones, including cortisol. Cortisol naturally peaks in the morning and plays a role in energy mobilization and alertness. However, when combined with a high glycemic meal, cortisol's rhythm can become dysregulated. This can contribute to metabolic stress and further impair glucose control throughout the day. Over time, repeated spikes in insulin can lead to insulin resistance. This is a condition where cells become less responsive to insulin's signal. As a result, the pancreas must produce even more insulin to achieve the same effect. This creates a cycle of chronically elevated insulin levels, which strongly favors fat accumulation, particularly in the abdominal area. From a metabolic standpoint, this also reduces mitochondrial efficiency. Mitochondria are responsible for producing energy at the cellular level. When the body is constantly driven by glucose spikes and insulin surges, mitochondria become less efficient at switching between fuel sources. This limits fat oxidation and keeps the body dependent on quick-burning carbohydrates. Furthermore, a high-carb breakfast lacking protein fails to activate satiety pathways effectively. Hormones such as leptin and peptide YY, which signal fullness to the brain, are not adequately stimulated. This often leads to increased hunger later in the day, cravings for more carbohydrates, and a higher overall caloric intake, further compounding fat storage issues. The key takeaway from a metabolic perspective is that breakfast composition is not just about calories. It is about hormonal signaling. A high-carbohydrate, low-protein breakfast sends a strong message to the body: store energy, suppress fat burning, and prepare for more glucose intake. Over time, this pattern reshapes metabolic function in a way that favors abdominal fat accumulation. Understanding this mechanism allows you to make more strategic nutritional choices in the morning, choices that support stable insulin levels, improved fat metabolism, and better long-term hormonal balance. If you consistently wake up feeling hungry, low on energy, or craving sugar before noon, the problem may not be your willpower. It may be your breakfast composition silently disrupting your hunger-regulating hormones. When you skip protein in the morning, you significantly reduce the stimulation of key satiety hormones, particularly peptide YY, PYY, glucagon-like peptide 1, GLP-1, and cholecystokinin, CCK. These hormones are produced in the gut and play a central role in signaling fullness to the brain. Without adequate protein intake early in the day, these hormonal signals remain weak, leaving the brain in a state of incomplete satiety. Protein is the most hormonally active macronutrient when it comes to appetite regulation. Unlike carbohydrates, which are rapidly absorbed and can lead to quick fluctuations in blood glucose, protein requires more complex digestion. This slower digestive process helps stabilize amino acid levels in the bloodstream, which directly influences satiety signaling pathways in the hypothalamus, the brain's central appetite control center. When protein is absent from breakfast, the body relies more heavily on carbohydrates for energy. This leads to a faster rise and fall in blood glucose levels. After the initial spike, insulin clears glucose from the bloodstream, often causing a relative drop in blood sugar. This drop is sensed by the brain as an energy deficit, triggering hunger signals even if sufficient calories were consumed earlier. In addition, insufficient morning protein intake reduces stimulation of GLP-1, a hormone that not only promotes satiety but also slows gastric emptying. When GLP-1 levels are low, food moves more rapidly through the digestive system, shortening the duration of fullness after eating. This creates a physiological environment where hunger returns sooner than it should. Peptide YY is another critical hormone affected by protein intake. It is released in response to food entering the small intestine, particularly in the presence of amino acids derived from protein digestion. PYY communicates with the brain to reduce appetite and decrease food intake. Without enough protein at breakfast, PYY secretion is significantly blunted, leading to weaker appetite suppression throughout the morning. From a metabolic standpoint, skipping protein in the morning also affects insulin dynamics. When breakfast is primarily carbohydrate-based, insulin is released in higher and more rapid bursts. Without the moderating effect of protein, this insulin response becomes less stable, increasing the likelihood of reactive hypoglycemia later. Reactive hypoglycemia is a condition where blood sugar drops too low after an initial spike, triggering strong cravings for quick energy sources, typically sugar or refined carbohydrates. This hormonal instability creates a cycle of increased hunger and higher calorie consumption. The brain interprets fluctuating glucose levels as a signal of energy scarcity, even if total calorie intake is sufficient. Over time, this can lead to chronic overeating, particularly in the form of snacking between meals. Protein also plays a crucial role in maintaining dopamine balance in the brain. Dopamine is involved in reward signaling and food motivation. Amino acids such as tyrosine and tryptophan are precursors for neurotransmitter synthesis. Without adequate dietary protein, neurotransmitter balance can become disrupted, potentially increasing cravings for high-reward foods like sugar and refined carbohydrates. Another important factor is the thermic effect of food. Protein has a significantly higher thermic effect compared to fats and carbohydrates, meaning the body expends more energy to digest and metabolize it. When breakfast lacks protein, this thermogenic response is reduced, resulting in lower overall energy expenditure in the morning hours. Over time, this can contribute to a slower metabolic rate. At the hormonal level, skipping protein in the morning can also indirectly affect cortisol regulation. Cortisol is naturally elevated in the early hours of the day and helps mobilize energy. However, without adequate protein intake, blood sugar stability is compromised, which can exaggerate cortisol's effects on glucose release from the liver. This may further contribute to unstable energy levels and increased appetite later in the day. Clinically, individuals who consistently consume low-protein breakfasts often report a pattern of early-day hunger, mid-morning fatigue, and strong carbohydrate cravings. These symptoms are not simply behavioral. They reflect underlying hormonal dysregulation involving insulin, GLP-1, PYY, and glucose control pathways. In summary, omitting protein from breakfast does not just affect fullness. It fundamentally alters the hormonal communication between the gut, pancreas, and brain. This disruption leads to weaker satiety signaling, unstable blood sugar levels, increased hunger, and a higher likelihood of overeating throughout the day. A protein-inclusive breakfast is therefore essential for maintaining hormonal stability and supporting long-term metabolic control. The timing of your breakfast doesn't just affect your energy levels, it directly influences your cortisol rhythm, insulin sensitivity, and whether your body stays in a fat-burning or fat-storing state for the rest of the day. When you consume refined carbohydrates at breakfast, such as white bread, pastries, sweetened cereals, or sugary drinks, you are introducing rapidly digestible glucose at a time when your endocrine system is highly sensitive. In the early morning, cortisol levels are naturally elevated. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone produced by the adrenal glands, and its primary role is to mobilize energy by increasing blood glucose availability through gluconeogenesis and glycogen breakdown. Under normal physiological conditions, this morning cortisol surge helps you wake up, feel alert, and maintain stable energy before your first meal. However, when refined carbohydrates are introduced during this period, the hormonal balance becomes disrupted. The sudden influx of glucose triggers a strong insulin response, which competes directly with cortisol's metabolic effects. This interaction is critical. Insulin is designed to lower blood glucose by driving glucose into cells, while cortisol raises blood glucose by releasing stored energy. When both hormones are activated intensely at the same time due to a high-sugar breakfast, the body experiences metabolic conflict. This can impair glucose regulation and reduce metabolic efficiency. One of the key consequences of this disruption is impaired cortisol rhythm regulation. Cortisol is supposed to follow a diurnal pattern, high in the morning, gradually declining throughout the day, and reaching its lowest point at night. This rhythm is essential for maintaining energy balance, immune function, and proper sleep cycles. However, repeated exposure to high glycemic breakfasts can flatten or distort this natural rhythm, leading to dysregulated stress hormone signaling. From a metabolic perspective, this dysregulation can contribute to reduced insulin sensitivity. When insulin is repeatedly spiked in the early hours of the day, cells may begin to respond less effectively over time. This condition, known as insulin resistance, forces the pancreas to produce even more insulin to achieve glucose clearance. Elevated insulin levels promote lipogenesis, particularly in adipose tissue around the abdominal region. Additionally, cortisol has a direct relationship with fat distribution. Chronically elevated or dysregulated cortisol levels are associated with increased visceral fat accumulation. Visceral fat is metabolically active and surrounds internal organs such as the liver, pancreas, and intestines. This type of fat is strongly linked to inflammatory markers, impaired glucose metabolism, and increased risk of metabolic syndrome. When refined carbohydrates are consumed in the morning, they also contribute to rapid fluctuations in blood glucose levels. This instability can place additional stress on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis, the central system regulating stress response. Over time, this can lead to exaggerated cortisol release patterns, or in some cases, adrenal fatigue-like symptoms characterized by low morning energy and poor stress tolerance. Another important aspect is the effect on hepatic glucose metabolism. The liver plays a central role in maintaining blood glucose balance, especially during the early morning fasting state. When high glycemic foods are consumed, the liver is forced to rapidly shift from endogenous glucose production to exogenous glucose processing. This abrupt metabolic shift can impair hepatic insulin sensitivity and contribute to fatty acid accumulation in liver cells over time. Refined carbohydrate breakfasts also suppress fat oxidation during the period when the body should ideally transition into efficient energy utilization. Instead of accessing stored fatty acids for fuel, the body becomes reliant on incoming glucose. This reduces mitochondrial flexibility, the ability of cells to switch between carbohydrate and fat metabolism efficiently. On a hormonal level, this pattern can also influence ghrelin, the hunger hormone. After a high-sugar breakfast, blood glucose may spike and then drop rapidly, triggering a compensatory increase in ghrelin secretion. This leads to earlier return of hunger and increased cravings for additional carbohydrates throughout the morning and afternoon. Furthermore, the interaction between insulin and cortisol affects inflammatory pathways. Elevated insulin levels combined with cortisol dysregulation can increase pro-inflammatory cytokines, contributing to systemic low-grade inflammation. This inflammatory state is closely linked with metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, and increased abdominal fat storage. In clinical terms, individuals who consistently consume refined carbohydrates at breakfast often experience a pattern of energy instability, midday fatigue, increased hunger, and progressive weight gain around the midsection. These are not isolated symptoms. They reflect a deeper hormonal imbalance involving cortisol rhythm disruption, insulin dysregulation, and impaired metabolic flexibility. In summary, refined carbohydrates at breakfast do more than elevate blood sugar. They interfere with the natural cortisol cycle, disrupt insulin sensitivity, impair liver metabolism, and promote conditions that favor fat storage over fat burning. Maintaining a balanced breakfast that stabilizes both cortisol and insulin is essential for preserving metabolic health and preventing long-term abdominal fat accumulation. A breakfast that looks light, healthy, or even diet-friendly on the surface can still trigger a powerful metabolic reaction in your body, one that leads to energy crashes, unstable blood sugar, and long-term fat accumulation around the abdomen. When you consume a low-fat, high-sugar breakfast, you are essentially delivering a rapid glucose load into the bloodstream without the regulatory buffering effect of dietary fat or sufficient protein. This combination is particularly problematic because fat plays a crucial physiological role in slowing gastric emptying, stabilizing postprandial glucose absorption, and moderating insulin secretion. Without it, carbohydrate absorption occurs at an accelerated rate. As glucose enters the bloodstream quickly, pancreatic beta cells respond by releasing insulin in a sharp and sometimes excessive pulse. This insulin surge is designed to move glucose into muscle and liver cells for energy storage. However, when the intake is heavily skewed towards simple sugars, the insulin response can overshoot the actual cellular energy demand. This sets the stage for a metabolic phenomenon known as reactive hypoglycemia. After the initial spike in blood glucose, insulin continues to exert its glucose-lowering effect, sometimes driving blood sugar below baseline levels. This drop is not just a numerical change in glucose concentration, it is a strong physiological signal to the brain that energy availability is insufficient. The brain, particularly the hypothalamus, is highly sensitive to fluctuations in glucose. When it detects a rapid decline, it activates counter-regulatory mechanisms involving glucagon, epinephrine, and cortisol. These hormones are released to restore blood glucose by stimulating glycogen breakdown and increasing hepatic glucose production. However, this hormonal counter-response can create a cycle of instability, especially when breakfast composition repeatedly triggers these swings. Cortisol in this context plays a particularly important role. It is a stress hormone that mobilizes energy reserves, but frequent activation in response to post-meal glucose crashes can lead to dysregulated cortisol patterns throughout the day. This may contribute to fatigue, irritability, and increased appetite signaling in later hours. At the same time, insulin fluctuations influence fat storage pathways. When insulin levels rise rapidly and then fall, the body enters a metabolic environment where energy is not consistently available at the cellular level. This inconsistency promotes increased hunger signaling through ghrelin and decreased satiety signaling through leptin. As a result, the individual is more likely to consume additional calories later in the day, often in the form of quick-digesting carbohydrates. Another important physiological consequence is the suppression of fat oxidation. In a low-fat breakfast scenario, the body is repeatedly exposed to glucose as the primary fuel source. Insulin not only facilitates glucose uptake, but also actively inhibits hormone-sensitive lipase, the enzyme responsible for breaking down stored triglycerides into free fatty acids. This means that even between meals, the body's ability to access fat stores is significantly reduced. Over time, this metabolic pattern encourages the accumulation of adipose tissue, particularly in visceral regions. Visceral fat is not merely a passive storage depot. It functions as an endocrine organ that secretes inflammatory cytokines such as interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. These inflammatory mediators further impair insulin signaling, contributing to a feedback loop of worsening metabolic dysfunction. Additionally, the absence of dietary fat at breakfast reduces the stimulation of key satiety hormones, including cholecystokinin and peptide YY. These hormones are typically released in response to fat and protein intake in the small intestine. Without their activation, the brain receives weaker signals of fullness, which contributes to early return of hunger and increased caloric intake throughout the day. From a mitochondrial perspective, repeated exposure to high-sugar, low-fat meals reduces metabolic flexibility. Mitochondria are responsible for switching between glucose and fatty acids as fuel sources depending on availability. However, when glucose is consistently dominant and fat oxidation is suppressed, mitochondrial efficiency declines. This reduces overall energy stability and may contribute to chronic fatigue patterns often reported in individuals with poor breakfast composition. Another key factor is hepatic metabolism. The liver is central to postprandial glucose regulation. When confronted with a rapid influx of sugar, it is forced to convert excess glucose into glycogen. Once glycogen stores are saturated, excess glucose is more likely to be converted into triglycerides through de novo lipogenesis. This process contributes directly to increased blood lipid levels and fat deposition in abdominal tissue. In summary, a low-fat, high-sugar breakfast creates a cascade of metabolic disturbances involving insulin spikes, reactive hypoglycemia, cortisol activation, impaired satiety signaling, and reduced fat oxidation. Over time, these repeated hormonal fluctuations promote energy instability, increased hunger, and a metabolic environment that favors abdominal fat accumulation rather than fat utilization. Your metabolism is not just about how many calories you eat, it's about how efficiently your cells can produce energy. And when that system starts to slow down in the morning, fat loss becomes significantly harder, even if your diet looks healthy on paper. When mitochondrial efficiency is reduced in the morning hours, the body's ability to generate ATP, the primary energy currency of cells, becomes impaired. Mitochondria are responsible for converting nutrients, mainly glucose and fatty acids, into usable energy through oxidative phosphorylation. This process determines whether your body is functioning in a fat-burning state or a fat-storing state. After waking up, the body is naturally primed for metabolic flexibility. Cortisol levels are elevated, insulin sensitivity is typically higher, and lipolysis, the breakdown of stored fat, is more active. In an optimal metabolic state, this is the period where the body should efficiently transition into fat oxidation. However, poor morning dietary patterns, especially those high in refined carbohydrates and low in protein and fat, can disrupt this process. When glucose is rapidly introduced into the system, insulin secretion increases sharply. Insulin not only regulates blood sugar, but also directly influences mitochondrial substrate preference. High insulin levels signal cells to prioritize glucose utilization over fatty acid oxidation. This reduces mitochondrial access to fat-derived fuels, effectively limiting the body's ability to burn stored fat in the early part of the day. Over time, repeated reliance on glucose as the primary energy source reduces mitochondrial metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility refers to the mitochondria's ability to switch efficiently between carbohydrate and fat oxidation depending on availability. When this flexibility is impaired, the body becomes metabolically rigid, meaning it struggles to utilize fat stores even during fasting or low-calorie periods. Another key factor is oxidative stress within the mitochondria. Frequent blood sugar spikes increase the production of reactive oxygen species during glucose metabolism. While mitochondria naturally generate some oxidative byproducts, excessive glucose flux can overwhelm antioxidant defense systems such as glutathione, superoxide dismutase, and catalase. This oxidative burden can impair mitochondrial membrane integrity and reduce ATP production efficiency. At the cellular level, reduced mitochondrial function leads to lower energy output, which is often perceived as fatigue, brain fog, or decreased physical stamina in the morning. However, the metabolic consequence goes deeper. When ATP production is inefficient, the body may compensate by increasing glucose dependency, further reinforcing carbohydrate-driven energy metabolism and suppressing fat utilization pathways. This dysfunction is also closely tied to insulin signaling. Insulin resistance at the cellular level is not only a blood sugar issue, but also a mitochondrial issue. When mitochondria become less responsive due to lipid accumulation or oxidative stress, insulin signaling pathways are disrupted. This creates a feedback loop where higher insulin levels are required to achieve the same glucose uptake, further inhibiting fat oxidation. In addition, mitochondrial efficiency is influenced by micronutrient status. Nutrients such as magnesium, B-complex vitamins, especially B1, B2, B3, and B5, and coenzyme Q10 are essential cofactors in the electron transport chain. Deficiencies in these nutrients can significantly impair ATP synthesis. A breakfast pattern lacking nutrient density contributes to gradual mitochondrial nutrient depletion over time. The hormonal environment also plays a critical role. Elevated insulin suppresses hormone-sensitive lipase, the enzyme responsible for mobilizing stored triglycerides into free fatty acids. Without adequate free fatty acid availability, mitochondria are deprived of one of their most efficient fuel sources. Fat oxidation becomes secondary, and carbohydrate dependence increases further. Additionally, impaired mitochondrial function affects signaling hormones such as leptin and adiponectin. Leptin resistance can develop when cellular energy status is chronically low despite sufficient caloric intake. This disrupts appetite regulation and increases the likelihood of overeating. Adiponectin, which enhances insulin sensitivity and promotes fatty acid oxidation, tends to decrease in states of mitochondrial dysfunction, further worsening metabolic imbalance. From a systemic perspective, reduced mitochondrial efficiency contributes to a lower basal metabolic rate. Even when resting, the body expends fewer calories because ATP production is less efficient. Over time, this can lead to gradual weight gain, particularly in visceral fat depots, even without significant increases in caloric intake. Clinically, individuals with impaired mitochondrial function often present with symptoms such as persistent fatigue, reduced exercise tolerance, increased carbohydrate cravings, and difficulty losing abdominal fat. These symptoms reflect an underlying shift in cellular energy metabolism rather than simply a caloric imbalance. In summary, reduced mitochondrial efficiency in the morning disrupts the body's natural ability to transition into fat-burning mode. It alters substrate utilization, impairs ATP production, increases insulin dependence, and reduces metabolic flexibility. Over time, this creates a physiological environment that favors energy storage over energy expenditure, contributing directly to stubborn abdominal fat accumulation and overall metabolic slowdown.